The moment a narcissist is truly done with you is not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not even cruel, it's silent. And that silence means you no longer exist. Because when they're really finished, they don't block you out of emotion, they erase you out of identity. And once that switch flips, there's no coming back. Most people think the end looks like anger, arguments, revenge. But that's not the end. That's attachment still fighting to survive. The real ending? It's when there's no reaction left to trigger. No curiosity about what you're doing. No urge to check, to control, to pull you back in. You could disappear tomorrow, and it wouldn't even register. That's when you know this isn't a phase, this isn't a tactic. This is psychological closure, and here's the part that hits hardest. It often happens long before you realize it. If you've ever experienced this kind of silence, where someone didn't just leave, but erased your presence completely, drop a comment below with the word invisible. Because understanding this moment is the first step to taking your power back. Total emotional withdrawal is the point where all visible and invisible lines of connection are cut at once. And what makes it confusing is how clean and quiet it feels compared to everything that came before it. Before this stage, even negative behavior, arguments, tension, sudden coldness, still carries emotional charge, which means there is still some level of psychological investment. But when withdrawal becomes total, that charge disappears completely. There is no attempt to provoke, no subtle signals, no checking in, no indirect ways of staying present in your awareness. It is not distance used as a tactic, it is distance as a final state. What's happening underneath is not just disinterest, but a full shutdown of attention toward you as a person. Attention is the currency here, and when it's gone, the connection effectively stops existing in their internal world. You may still remember, analyze, and feel the absence, but from their perspective, there is no ongoing loop involving you anymore. This is why it feels so disorienting. Because the shift is not gradual in a way you can track emotionally. One moment, there is some form of engagement, even if unhealthy, and the next there is nothing to respond to at all. This kind of withdrawal also removes unpredictability. Earlier phases are often defined by inconsistency, sometimes present, sometimes distant, which keeps you mentally engaged and trying to figure things out. Total withdrawal ends that cycle abruptly. There are no mixed signals left to interpret because there are no signals at all. The silence is not hiding meaning, it is the absence of it. Another key aspect is that this withdrawal does not seek recognition. When someone is using silence as a strategy, there is usually an expectation that you will notice, react, or chase. Here, there is no such expectation. Whether you react or not has no impact, because your response is no longer part of their focus. The absence remains unchanged regardless of what you do, which is why it feels so final and unresponsive. Identity reassignment is a deeper psychological shift where you are no longer seen as a meaningful individual in their internal world, but instead recategorized into something neutral, distant, and functionally irrelevant. Earlier on, even if the dynamic was unhealthy, there was still a defined role attached to you. Someone who triggered emotion, provided attention, or held some level of importance in their mental structure. That role kept you active in their awareness. When reassignment happens, that role is removed entirely and replaced with a new label that carries no emotional weight. This is not about forgetting in a literal sense, but about altering significance. The mind organizes people based on perceived value and impact, and once that value drops to zero, the brain no longer prioritizes thoughts, reactions, or curiosity about that person. You go from being someone who occupies space in their decision-making process to someone who doesn't register in it at all. It's similar to how strangers exist in the background of daily life, visible but not processed in any meaningful way. What makes this difficult to grasp is that identity reassignment is internal and invisible. There is no announcement, no external marker that clearly signals it has happened. From your side, it can feel like a sudden disappearance of recognition, as if the version of you that once mattered has been quietly replaced by a version that no longer exists to them. Interactions, if they happen at all, feel flat, detached, and stripped of any previous familiarity because the mental framework that gave those interactions meaning is gone. This shift also explains why attempts to reconnect often feel ineffective. Effort, emotion, or explanation rely on the assumption that you still hold a place in their perception. Once reassignment occurs, those efforts have nowhere to land. There is no active role to return to, no emotional memory being engaged in a way that influences present behavior. You are not being pushed away or resisted. You are simply no longer positioned as someone relevant enough to respond to in a meaningful way. Narrative closure is the internal process where they construct a final, self-consistent story about what happened, why it happened, and what it means going forward. And once that story feels complete to them, there is no psychological need to revisit you again. This isn't about truth or accuracy, it's about coherence. The mind prefers a stable explanation over an unresolved loop, so it assembles a version of events that removes ambiguity and reinforces their sense of control. In that version, your role is reduced to something already understood, already explained, and therefore no longer worth analyzing. What makes this powerful is that once a narrative feels finished, the brain treats it like a closed file. There's no curiosity pulling attention back, no emotional tension asking for resolution. Even if the story is distorted or incomplete, it serves its purpose by eliminating uncertainty. You become part of a concluded chapter rather than an ongoing question. This is why there is no return to figure things out or to seek clarity, because from their perspective, clarity already exists. This closure often reframes the entire connection in a simplified way. Complex dynamics get reduced into a single interpretation that justifies the ending and removes any need for further engagement. The past is compressed into a clean storyline where everything fits neatly, even if that neatness comes from ignoring nuance. Once that storyline is accepted internally, it becomes the reference point for all future thoughts about you, which means there's no reason to update it or challenge it. Another important aspect is that narrative closure removes emotional hooks. Earlier, unresolved experiences create mental loops, moments replayed, questions revisited, outcomes imagined differently. Closure cuts those loops off by assigning them a fixed meaning. Without those loops, attention naturally moves elsewhere because there is nothing left to process. You are no longer a source of unanswered questions or emotional tension, which is why the mind stops returning to you altogether. Supply replacement or internalization is the shift where the need that was once directed toward you is either redirected to another source or absorbed inward in a way that no longer depends on your presence. What matters here is not the person themselves, but the function they served: attention, validation, stimulation, or a sense of control. When that function is fulfilled elsewhere, or no longer requires an external target, your role becomes unnecessary. In the case of replacement, the transition can appear abrupt from the outside. Attention that once focused on you is now invested somewhere new, often with the same intensity that previously defined your interaction. This isn't about comparison or superiority, it's about continuity of function. The mind maintains its patterns by finding a new outlet, which allows it to move forward without revisiting the previous connection. Because the underlying need is being met, there is no psychological pressure to return to what came before. Internalization works differently, but leads to the same outcome. Instead of seeking external input, the individual reduces reliance on outside sources altogether. Attention turns inward, and the need for engagement becomes minimal or selectively controlled. This can create the impression of detachment or independence, where interactions are no longer driven by the same urgency or frequency. In this state, reconnecting with past sources holds little appeal because the system has adapted to function without them. Both pathways eliminate dependency. Whether the need is outsourced to someone else or neutralized internally, the result is the same. There is no gap left for you to fill. Attempts to re-enter the dynamic encounter a closed loop because the original reason for the connection has already been resolved through other means. This is why the shift feels definitive. It's not about rejection or avoidance, but about the absence of necessity, where the role you once occupied no longer exists in any practical or psychological sense. The absence of Hoover attempts is one of the clearest indicators that the dynamic has fully ended, because it reflects a complete lack of motivation to re-establish contact or regain influence. Earlier in the cycle, silence or distance is often temporary and purposeful, designed to create curiosity, provoke a reaction, or pull you back into engagement. Even after separation, there are usually subtle or direct attempts to reopen the connection. Messages, indirect signals, sudden reappearances, or behaviors meant to reinsert themselves into your awareness. These actions depend on the assumption that there is still value in reconnecting. When those attempts disappear entirely, it signals a fundamental shift in that assumption. There is no longer a perceived benefit in reaching out, no expectation of gaining attention, and no interest in reactivating the previous dynamic. This absence is not strategic patience or a delayed move. It is the removal of intent. Without intent, there is no reason to initiate contact, even in subtle or indirect ways. What makes this difficult to interpret is that people often expect some form of return, especially if there has been a pattern of coming back in the past. That expectation is based on previous behavior, where disconnection was temporary and followed by re-engagement. When the pattern breaks and nothing follows, it creates uncertainty, leading to questions about timing or hidden motives. However, the defining feature here is consistency. Nothing happens not just once, but repeatedly over time, regardless of circumstances. Another important aspect is that the lack of hoovering remains unaffected by external triggers. Changes in your life, visible or invisible, do not prompt a response. There is no monitoring, no indirect acknowledgement, and no attempt to reinsert presence when opportunities arise. The silence is stable and unresponsive, indicating that your existence is no longer part of their active consideration. This stability is what differentiates it from temporary withdrawal, where silence eventually breaks under the right conditions. Indifference over hatred is the final emotional state where all intensity collapses into neutrality, and what makes it significant is that it requires less energy than any other reaction. Hatred, anger, and resentment all demand attention and ongoing mental engagement. They keep a person mentally connected because they involve replaying events, assigning blame, and maintaining a sense of opposition. Even negative emotion still creates a bond because it keeps the other person active in thought and feeling. Indifference removes that bond completely. In this state, there is no desire to react, correct, or even acknowledge. Your presence no longer triggers a shift in mood or focus. You could appear, disappear, succeed, or fail, and none of it generates a meaningful internal response. This is not suppression of feeling, it is the absence of it. Emotional systems tend to prioritize what feels relevant, and when something is no longer relevant, it fades out of awareness naturally rather than being pushed away. What makes indifference difficult to process is that it lacks visible markers. Anger is obvious, distance can be noticed, but indifference is quiet and often mistaken for calm or maturity. From the outside, it may even look stable or controlled, but internally, it reflects disengagement. There is no curiosity driving questions, no emotional residue pulling attention back, and no sense of unfinished business. This shift also explains why attempts to provoke a reaction tend to fail. Effort that once would have triggered a response now meets a flat, unchanged state. Without emotional investment, there is nothing to activate. The system does not escalate or defend because it no longer perceives a reason to do so. Over time, this lack of response becomes consistent across situations, reinforcing the absence of connection and making it clear that the emotional link has dissolved rather than simply gone dormant. In the end, the real signal isn't what they say or how they leave. It's what remains afterward. No reaction, no return, no curiosity, no emotional trace. Not distance used as a move, but distance that never changes. Each sign leads to the same point. You've been removed from their internal world in a way that doesn't require explanation or closure. What feels confusing at first becomes clear over time. When attention is gone, when the role is erased, when the story is finished, when the need is replaced or disappears, when there are no attempts to reconnect, and when even strong emotion fades into neutrality, there is nothing left holding the connection in place. It's not hidden, delayed, or waiting to come back. It's complete. And while that can feel like loss, it also reveals something important. Anything that can disappear without resistance was never rooted in something stable to begin with. What remains now is not their silence, but your awareness of it. And in that awareness is where control shifts. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you stop waiting for something that has already ended.